You're listening to episode 217 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Author Greta Christina joins us to speak about her new mini-book, Comforting Thoughts About Death That Have Nothing to Do with God. Given enough time, the survival rate of life is exactly 0. There are no exceptions. At some point, we will all die. Different religions, including Buddhism, have different assertions about what happens when we die that are conflicting, and yet spoken about with glib certainty by the living, who've managed to still have a pulse. So what about us atheists, secular humanists, and secular Buddhists? What ideas come up for us in our natural-centric worldview? Greta Christina has been writing professionally since 1989 on topics including atheism, sexuality and sex positivity, LGBT issues, politics, culture, and whatever crosses her mind. She is the author of Why Are You Atheists So Angry? 99 Things That Piss Off the Godless, and of Bending, dirty, kinky stories about pain, power, religion, unicorns, and more, and is the editor of Paying For It, a guide for sex workers for their clients. She has been a public speaker for many years and is on the speakers bureaus of the Secular Student Alliance. Her writing has appeared in multiple magazines and newspapers, including Ms., Penthouse, Chicago Sun-Times, On Our Backs, and Skeptical Inquirer, and numerous anthologies, including Everything You Know About God Is Wrong, and 3 volumes of Best American Erotica. She lives in San Francisco with her wife, Ingrid. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice tab, because how long has it been since you've had one of those? Our guest today is Greta Christina. Greta, welcome to the podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
I'm so glad to have you on The Secular Buddhist as well. We've had you on our other podcast, Present Moment, to talk about your meditation practice. And I thought we'd just dive in for a moment and ask about that. For folks who are listening, I have linked several of Greta's terrific blogs about her meditative experiences and what that's been like on the episode page for this episode. Have you kept up with meditation? What's that been like for you?
I have been. I've been finding that what works for me is to do it about 5 or 6 days a week. I find that for myself, if I try to be really, really disciplined and do it absolutely every day, it becomes a chore. Whereas if it's more like, I do this every day, except when it really doesn't work. And that, usually comes out as being about 5 or 6 days a week. And then that turns it into, this is just a part of my life, but there's any part of my life that if it's just really a terrible day, I'd be willing to drop. And yeah, I have kept it up, and it's been interesting the way that it both has dramatically changed my life while ultimately not really changing anything.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And I'm wondering if you'd you care to unpack that a little bit, because that can be something of an eyebrow raiser.
Well, there's a koan or saying, I guess it is, the before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. And it feels a little bit like that, although I'm not sure I would use enlightenment as the word to describe having started meditating. But the way my life looks like is not radically different. I do the same kinds of things. I have the same kinds of emotions. My activities are much the same. I still get mad. I still get joyful. I still get irritated. I still, just take deep pleasure in things. I still, spend too much time on Facebook and all that. But what I found is just that my experience of it is different. And sometimes it's subtly different and sometimes it's dramatically different. And for me, one of the best ways I can describe it is that I'm more comfortable being uncomfortable. That if I'm having an emotion or an experience that's difficult for me, I'm less inclined to just try to shut it down, to try to fix it, to try to distract myself from it. And I'm more inclined to just say, okay, this is how I feel right now. This is what I'm experiencing. I'm having a depressive episode. I'm feeling bored. I'm feeling irritated, and to just let that be. And I found that in not trying to fix every little experience that's difficult to experience, sort of the overall quality of my life has gone up, that because that, that experience of constantly managing and constantly trying to tinker and, oh, I just feel a little bit itchy right now, so I have to fix it right back. That's not a pleasant way to live. That constant monitoring and constant management is itself anxiety producing and unpleasant, and that letting myself just experience whatever I'm experiencing. And it makes it sort of possible to do, for lack of a better word, triage. It's like, okay, is this like something that's really seriously wrong and I have to do something about it? Or is this just, I'm itchy and I'm uncomfortable and I'm bored and I can just let that be?
Yeah. It's interesting to hear how that has changed for you since the last time we spoke, which was a little over a year ago about this. And one of the things that you were challenged with, and this was really our second interview, was you asking me these questions around finding time and when do you do this and how do you make it a regular part of your life. And it sounds like you've done that if you're practicing that many times per week. What did you find for you was the best way to handle that?
Well, I can talk about what worked for me. I'm not sure how helpful it will be to other people because I don't have a very regular life. I don't have like a 9-to-5 day job or any kind of a like regular day job with regular hours. I'm a freelance writer. I do public speaking. I travel a lot for public speaking. And so my routine isn't very routine. So what works for me is to basically just commit to doing some meditation every day or almost every day, whenever that is. And, and I have like some times that work for me really well, like right after I eat breakfast is, often a good time, but my life is just not regular enough for that to always work. And one thing that's really helped is if I don't have time to find 20 minutes or 30 minutes to meditate, I meditate for 10, I meditate for 5. And, and that's less than ideal. I'd rather have a longer session for a number of reasons, but it kind of keeps me in the practice and it keeps me in the habit of doing it. And I guess another way that I think of it is, I do a quote unquote formal, I don't know if that's the best word for it, a set aside. It's like, I am now sitting down and meditating 5 or 6 days a week, usually for 20 minutes, sometimes less, sometimes more. But I also do taking a moment to just be here in my life, to just stop and experience whatever I'm experiencing. I do that several times a day. Sometimes that's 30 seconds. Sometimes that's a minute. Sometimes it's 10 seconds. That's in a lot of ways more important than the formal practice. And in some ways, the formal practice, it's practice in the literal sense. It's like practicing the piano so you can play a song. It makes it easier and more fluid for me to fold those moments of being present and being mindful just in my everyday life. And if I do that several times a day, then it doesn't matter quite as much if today was just not a day where I was going to have a set aside 20-minute practice.
Yeah, beautifully said. And that goes so well to this formal, informal practice, that there's that time where we sit and do a formal meditation and we set the boundaries around that and we dedicate ourselves to it. And that's like doing the scales on a musical instrument. and tuning that and tuning yourself. And then when you're out in the world, taking a few moments whenever you can to play music.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, let's talk about what we're here to chat about, which is your new mini book, Comforting Thoughts About Death That Have Nothing to Do with God, which for this audience of secular folks who tend to not adhere to afterlife thoughts, and as Buddhists who also tend not to adhere to thoughts of a monolithic deity, that would seem to resonate with this cruise. So tell us a little bit about what prompted you to write this book.
Well, when I was leaving my own religious and spiritual beliefs, one of the most difficult things about it was letting go of my belief in an afterlife. When I finally accepted that there really is, not only is there no God, and I never really believed in this classic theistic God, but that there's no supernatural substance, there's no world soul, I don't have a soul. Really, what I am is my body, what there is in the world is the physical world, and when I die, I'm really gone. That was very traumatic and very upsetting. It was probably the hardest thing about letting go of my spiritual beliefs. And I kind of had to do it on my own. I wasn't familiar with a humanist community, a skeptical community, an atheist community. I wasn't really familiar with the writings of, people who had thought about this before me and had come to terms with mortality. And so I kind of had to do it on my own. I kind of had to reinvent the wheel and come up with my own ways of coping with my own eventual mortality and with the death of people that I cared about. And I don't want anybody else to have to go through that alone. I think we all deal with death in different ways, but certainly many of the ideas that have helped me deal with mortality and grief, other people I've talked with say, yes, I find some of these helpful as well. And so it's essentially just that. I don't want other people to have to go through coping with mortality without, with real final mortality on their own.
So you have several parts in the book devoted to, quotey fingers here, just the meaning of death. And you talk about some of the challenges that every person goes through that can impact thoughts or feelings on that. What are some of the things you describe about this?
There's a number of things, ways of looking at death that have helped me come to more terms with it and, accept it with some degree of peace. And certainly one of them for me is the idea of death as a deadline. I mean, I tend to be a very deadline-driven person. It's a deadline, I'm a very deadline-driven person. And one of the things that I say in the book is that I would love to think of myself as the kind of person who, if I magically were immortal, I would do just all these wonderful things with that immortality. I would spend the first 100 years, reading all the great works of literature, and I'd spend another 100 years, devoting myself to taking care of the world and to helping, people who are sick and poor and trodden upon. And I'd spend another 100 years traveling the globe. I know myself. I would spend eternity sitting on the sofa watching television because I don't have that sense of there being a time limit. It's like, I can do all that stuff later. I can do all that wonderful literature and, changing the world stuff. I've got time to do that. Knowing that I'm mortal is a lot of what drives me to make something of my life, to produce something that I think is meaningful and that will make the world a better place. It's a lot of what drives me to try to make the world better, not just for myself, but for other people. I mean, if we're mortal, if this life is all there is, and there's millions, billions of people who are just born into poverty and despair and their entire life is misery, that's not okay. And I want to try to do what little I can to try to make that better. And it's also a lot of what drives me to really savor this life and to really experience it. It's like I don't have infinite time here. And so knowing that makes me less inclined to just kind of tune out and space out. And it makes me more inclined to really be present in my life and really experience it.
Yeah, you talked very eloquently about how your own midlife crisis effectively helped motivate you to really wrestle with this and look at it. How did that play out for you?
Oh, well, so in my 20s and 30s, I was a little bit aimless, and specifically, I was a little bit aimless about my writing. I knew that I wanted to be a writer, and I did some writing. I was writing, kind of part-time on the side, but I was never super driven about it. And what happened was I turned 40, and I had this kind of classic midlife crisis. I mean, I think midlife crises kind of fall into two categories. There's the, I'm going to buy a sports car and have affairs with people who are much younger than me. And then there's sort of the, oh my gosh, I have to reinvent my life because it isn't what I want it to be. And I just realized, I'm 40. I don't have infinite time. And it's not, I mean, I knew that intellectually, but there's something about turning 40 for me that made it really stare me in the face and say, look, if you want to do this, if you want to make something of your life, you need to really start now. And I realized I didn't want to be on my deathbed wishing that I had tried to really be a full-time writer and regretting that I never really went for it. And so how that played out for me was I had a job that was a pretty high-paying job, but it was very stressful, demanded a huge amount of my time and energy, gave me very little at the end of the day, very little left. And I quit that job and I took another job that paid much less, but that had shorter hours and more flexible hours and was less demanding so that I could put more time and energy into writing. And I am now today a full-time freelance writer and public speaker. And I realized that I got lucky with that. I mean, some of that was hard work and talent, and some of it was luck and help. But I would never have done that, I think, if it hadn't been for death and mortality staring me in the face and saying, you don't have infinite time here. What are you going to do about it?
Did you end up finding that this not having an afterlife concept, not having that as part of your life, did that color your perceptions? Was it a liberating kind of thing, or how did you deal with that?
Well, when I was first letting go of my spiritual beliefs, I did not experience it as liberating, I'll be honest. And I think, again, partly because I felt isolated. I wasn't connected with a community of people who had gone through this before me. So when I first was letting go of it, I did not experience it as liberating. It was very upsetting. It was very traumatic. But once I became accustomed to, once I finally, it's like, this is it. There really is no afterlife. There really is no soul. It was liberating in the sense that when I did have spiritual, supernatural beliefs, I always knew somewhere in the back of my mind that I was lying to myself. I always knew that this was kind of wishful thinking. And this is one of the things I talk about in the book, that my experience and the experience of many other people is that religious beliefs about death are only comforting when you don't think about them very carefully. And when you really examine them, it's like they don't make sense and they're kind of incoherent. They're internally contradictory and they're not grounded in reality. And so when I was a spiritual believer, when I believed in the supernatural, and I was relying on that belief to help get me through grief or fear of my own mortality, there was always this kind of sense of unease, and I couldn't really think about those beliefs very carefully, and I would kind of kept shoving it to the back burner. And now that I've accepted the reality of, that when I die, it's really going to be the end, and when other people in my life die, it's really the end, my humanist and my skeptical and my naturalist views of death, I find them much more comforting on a much deeper level. They're much more sustainingly comforting. And, and they give me a sense of there really being a strong foundation underneath me because I know that they're grounded in reality and I know I'm not lying to myself. And that's, I'm not sure if liberating is exactly the word I would use, but I won't argue with it, certainly. It liberated me, I guess, from the burden of self-deception.
Yeah, and I think that background hum of cognitive dissonance,
yes,
is something that may have quieted at that point.
Exactly.
So you talk for a bit in the book about experiencing our emotions, and I know that's part of the meditative practice. Talk for a little bit about that.
Well, one of the things that I've found most comforting and that gives me most solace in the face of grief and in the face of my own mortality is, this may sound paradoxical, but it's accepting that this is hard, accepting that this is painful, accepting that it sucks. And, again, when I had, supernatural beliefs, I always had this sort of guilt and this sort of sense of unease. And it's like, I should be comforted, but I'm not. It's like I should feel okay about death because it's not really real and I'm going to see everybody again someday later. Why am I feeling so torn up about it? And there was this sense of guilt and anxiety about it. And, accepting that, okay, yes, death is real. And, it's just a natural part of how animal bodies work. But also accepting that the fear of death and accepting that grief when people we love die, that's also natural. And that's liberating in a sense because I'm not trying to make myself not feel what I feel. And I'm not trying to, lie to myself about, well, you shouldn't be feeling grief. You shouldn't be feeling fear. You shouldn't be feeling loss, because, hey, you're really going to see everybody again someday. So don't worry about it. And I think that's, especially for people who have more conventional religious beliefs, people who believe in heaven and so on, but even people who believe in something like, say, reincarnation. I think that they often do have this sense of guilt when they grieve, and they have this sense of guilt when they are afraid for their own death, because I shouldn't be feeling like that. I'm going to be going into the loving arms of Jesus, so why does it matter? And yet I'm still grieving. And so knowing that, no, this sucks. This is hard. This is painful. And I can just let myself have that. I don't have to deny it.
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting you mentioned on, let's see if I can find it here on page 22, you talk a little bit about that, about how it makes perfect sense when you think of religion not as a way of genuinely coping with the fear of death, but as a way of putting it on the back burner. That there's this, I can deal with that stuff later. I don't need to deal with it now because, hey, I've got an afterlife.
Right.
And that's, as you say, a dominant way that we deal with it in our culture.
It is. And one of the things that surprised me at first, and then once I started thinking about it, it made perfect sense. There's some research about how people who are very religious deal with death as opposed to people who are less religious or who are secular. And what researchers have found is that people who are very religious are actually more likely in the last week of their life to have extreme medical interventions. They're more likely to get the tubes and the resuscitation and so on, whereas people who are more secular or less religious are more likely to just say, okay, this is it. This is the end, and I'm letting go now. Also, people who are more religious tend to be less prepared for death. They're less likely to have made out wills. They're less likely to have advanced medical directives about what to do when they're dying. And that's one of the things that really did make me realize believers and even many non-believers tend to think of religion as, well, of course, it's this wonderful, comforting thing in the face of death. If that's true, then why is it that when the reality of death is facing people, they're freaked out by it and they can't deal with it? Whereas secular people are more likely to be more prepared for it and to be more accepting of it when it's at the very end of life. And so that is one of the things that made me think of religion. It's not actually a coping mechanism. It's a way of distracting or pretending that death isn't real.
Greta, is there anything else you'd like to share with the listeners about this book? What's something that you really want them to get out of it?
I think one of the most important things is that non-believers do, I think, tend to concede the ground of death to religion. We do have this tendency to say, of course, religion has a better angle on death, and, non-belief has a better angle on all these other things. We have better ways of dealing with sex. We have better ways of dealing with science. We have better ways of dealing with lots of things, and also it has the benefit of being true, which is a nice benefit. But I don't think we have to do that. And I do think that non-religious ways of dealing with death can be profoundly comforting. And, comfort doesn't mean it makes fear or grief disappear. It just means that it gives us a sense of something to come back to when we are terribly gripped by fear or grief. It gives us a sense that, there is a life that's worth returning to. And it takes the edge off, for lack of a better word. It makes it less, all-encompassing. It softens it. And that's what I mean by comfort. And I think I would really like for us to talk about that. I don't want us to concede that ground. I want us to talk about how we deal with death, because I think that a lot of people who are questioning their religious beliefs or in process of letting go of those religious beliefs, that's often one of the things that's most difficult. And I think that if our ideas about this are just kind of out there in the air, then they'll have an easier time letting go. And, I certainly know that, when I was confronting a very painful and upsetting time in my life, a couple of years ago, my father died, and literally less than 2 weeks later, I was diagnosed with cancer. And that was, boy, talk about death staring you in the face. I mean, that was right there. And the cancer's, I'll reassure listeners, the cancer's fine. They got it, took it out with surgery, and I'm good now. But I kept waiting for that moment when I wished I believed. I kept waiting for, it's like, gosh, this is really sucks. This is very, very painful. This is just one of the worst times of my life. And I kept waiting to wish that I believed, and it never happened. I actually found that imagining religious ideas about death didn't comfort me. They were upsetting. They made me angry. They made me guilt-ridden. They kind of tied me up in knots. And when I looked at my humanist and naturalist ways of looking at death, I mean, again, it didn't make things magically better, but they were a real comfort, and they did help, and they did get me through it. And I want to let people know that it is possible to deal with this. So let's talk about it, and let's give that gift of how we see death to the world, so that other people who are questioning or wrestling with these issues don't have to go it alone.
Yeah, I think it's a great way to help pave the path and make it something that people have the permission to question this, and they have the permission to wonder about this as they may be transitioning out of a religious framework.
Yes, exactly.
Well, our guest today is Greta Christina, and the book will be linked on the episode page for this episode. There are a few different ways to get it, but you'll be able to do that right on the site. And to follow up with what Greta's doing, you can find her on freethoughtblogs.com/Greta, which will also be linking on the episode page. Greta, thanks for being here. Nice to speak with you as always.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.